Hello, and welcome to the first CJS Colloquium this fall. I am Junko Habu, the chair of the Center for Japanese Studies and professor of anthropology, and I'm the host of today's event. Today's colloquium is titled The Audibility of Strangers, Music and Disparate Japanese Communities in Prewar, White Australia. Our speaker today is Professor Hugh Ferranti of the Institute for Liberal Arts of Tokyo Institute of Technology, or TITEC. This is the first CJS event that is jointly co-organized with the Institute for Liberal Arts of TITEC. I'd like to start this colloquium with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona band. We recognize that the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. We have two CJS faculty members with us today. Professor Bonnie Wade will introduce our speaker, and Dr. Keiko Yamanaka will be our discussant. Professor Ferranti will first give his talk for about 40 minutes. You can submit questions at any point during the talk using the chat function. Please do not use Q&A function. Bonnie, please introduce our speaker.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Our speaker today, Professor Hugh Ferranti, is a Japanologist whose academic career has been deeply international. Australian by birth, his advanced degrees are both Japanese and Australian, an MA in music from Tokyo National University of Fine Arts and Music in 1989, and a PhD in music from the University of Sydney in 1997. The theses for both focused on Zato Biwa, a venerable Satsuma tradition of recitation, self-accompanied on the biwa, the oral narrative texts of the Heike Monogatari. Pursuing documentation of that tradition historically, contextually, textually, and musically, with funding from a Japan Foundation doctoral dissertation grant, Ferranti's research was what we in music would call an ethnomusicological tour de force, due to the patience and persistence required to work for a year in Kyushu dialect with a 92-year-old, blind, nearly toothless, rural singer, Yamashika Yoshiyuki, who, as Hugh wrote in 1994, had, quote, by his own account, been unable to perform his Higo Biwa tradition for several years, end quote. From the mid-1970s, however, Yamashika had been sort of a cultural hero in Japan as the last practitioner of that venerable tradition. I believe I'm correct in saying that Hugh's first acquaintance with academics in the US occurred in a 1994 semester here at Berkeley while writing his dissertation and contributing an article on Yamashika to the Department of Music's interdisciplinary graduate journal called Repercussions. That article can still be accessed at the campus site ocf.berkeley.edu. His first official academic experience in the US, however, was appointment as a Mellon postdoctoral teaching research fellow for 1996 to 97 at Cornell. From there, he segued immediately to an assistant professorship in the Department of Musicology at the University of Michigan, with a joint appointment as specialist in Japanese performing arts in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. Unfortunately for us here in the US, family circumstances caused him to leave that post to take another in 2003 at the University of New England in Armidale, Australia, where he taught for 9 years as Associate Professor of Japanese Studies in the School of Languages, Cultures, and Linguistics, and in the School of Arts. Since 2011, his current post as professor in the Center for Language Research and Teaching Institute for Liberal Arts at Tokyo Institute of Technology has permitted him to put those recurring prongs of his interest together. Based on the PhD thesis, Hugh's first monograph was published in the Cornell University East Asia series as The Last Biwa Singer, quote, a blind musician in history, imagination, and performance. For that book, he received the Tanabe Hisao Award, a prize given annually by the Toyo Ongaku Gakkai. A link between that early interest in the biwa and subsequent research was attention to biwa in compositions by contemporary composer Takemitsu Toru, as De Ferranti worked as author, but also as co-translator, annotator, and co-editor with Japanese scholars on multiple publications related to that in the early 2000s. In 2007, he was co-recipient of the Bunkacho's Superior Accomplishment in the Arts Award as initiator of and member of a production team for a 3-CD set titled Rites and Tales with Biwa for the recording label Nihon Dento Gei no Shinko Zaidan. Hugh's research endeavors have taken him entirely other directions as well. And I must say, directions that have furthered attention in Japanese music studies to topics less focused on historical hogaku, more focused on, for instance, whatever music the residents in the Osaka area have been making, including ethnic minorities, specifically Koreans and Okinawans. Also, a focus on colonial modernity, especially pre-World War II and wartime. To pursue those perspectives, he led a group project from 2007 through 2009 with funding by the Australian Research Council. With such a broad palette, Hugh de Ferranti is to be commended, I think, for his intellectual leadership and the depth of his research and writing that is both published and forthcoming in both English and Japanese. But there is more, and that brings us to today's talk. From 2017 to 19, he led a project on music among newcomer migrants of the Tokyo region that was sponsored by Kaken, the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science. The research documented that in a place and time of default monoculturalism and prejudice, recent minority migrants use music to consolidate their own communities and strengthen relations with the Japanese host majority. From that project, Professor de Ferranti has turned for comparison to a context less familiar perhaps to Japanologists, but likewise a place and time of default monoculturalism and prejudice, namely Australia from the 1880s through 1930s. But he has flipped the perspective from that of the Tokyo-centered group project. The migrants under consideration are Japanese who migrated to Australia in that pre-World War period. Did the Japanese as a migrant minority use music, he asks, and if so, how? It's time to find out. Over to Hugh de Ferranti.
Thank you, Professor Wade. Thank you, Bonnie, for such a generous and insightful introduction. And thanks for your generosity in so many ways in the nearly 30 years that we've been acquainted. All right, just to give a little background to this most recent project that Bonnie described, I was asked to be the daihosha, what we'd call the chief investigator in Australia of a project proposal to the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, kakenhi funding, as it's known in Japan. And this, given the topic, which was to be music and minorities in and of Japan, I had to find a topic, or that of reflects the topic that I happened upon. I needed a topic that would enable me, for family reasons, domestic reasons, to do the research from this room, the living room that I'm sitting in now, and of course my office at Tokyo Tech. I knew I wouldn't be able to go and do lots of field work on a weekday evening, weekends with the members of the project team, or indeed on my own. So essentially I needed an archival research topic. And I felt that, well, in fact, one arc within arcs over the years that I've been doing research on Japan and Japanese music is looking at projections of Japan in music in Australia. In fact, my honours thesis for the Bachelor of Music was on the images of gagaku in the music of the leading Australian art composers at the time. And then later on, I did a project on staged taiko, wadaiko, kumidaiko, if you like, in Australia. So there is a kind of logical thread to deciding to look at the music making, or musicking, I might dare to say that occasionally, of the Japanese in old Australia. Thus the topic that I've come to. It did turn out, however, that there was some field work that I could do even down the road from Tokyo Tech, from Thai Tech in Kawasaki. I have become friends with a man who's now 94-year-old, who'll figure in some of the slides I'm going to show. And I was even able to get down to the Kansai and meet a man who was 98 at the time, and a wonderful lady who turned 97 last month. At any rate, I'll share my screen and launch into the talk itself. I take it you can all see that. There we go. Right. As of yesterday, I've been here in Kawagoe for 10 years. In that time, and especially in the last 2 years, I've noticed a marked increase in the numbers of Vietnamese, Nepalese, and Sri Lankan people. I often hear them speaking their languages, but I do not hear their voices as active participants in the civic life of this city of 300,000 on the edge of Tokyo. For now, they're in effect silent strangers to the people of Kawagoe, except those few Japanese who go to eat in the Indo-Nepali and Sri Lankan restaurants. Here's one next to a famous unagi restaurant, or the even fewer Japanese who shop at the Asia food and ethnic goods stores. Now that silence seems at odds with the appearance of the expression that's translated as multicultural coexistence, tabunka kyosei, in bulletins and mail-outs from the city council, and more broadly, the proliferation of that expression in the Japanese government's policy text since 2006. That's its first appearance. Bureaucratic sloganeering notwithstanding, no governing politician nor national government document refers to immigration, nor to any of the newcomers in Japan as migrants, though ironically, the official English title for the relevant government unit is, of course, Immigration Services Agency of Japan. That's immigration in another sense. That denial of the existence of immigrants continues despite the watershed changes that came with introduction of new specified skilled workers visa categories in April 2019, and the projected quotas of hundreds of thousands of such foreign workers in the next decade. At the same time, beyond a handful of municipalities and some wards in Tokyo and Osaka where foreign residents are especially numerous, everyday life in Japan continues with default monocultural assumptions about ethnic homogeneity and embedded practices of what one trusts are unintentional exclusion. That's probably nothing new to most of you. Turning to music, or the music making of minorities. For minorities who stand in diverse relationship to ideas of race and nation, music is important both for sustenance of communal and individual well-being and for efforts to gain recognition and equitability within multiracial societies. And that's, of course, true for both foreign minorities or migrants and indigenous minorities, but it's the foreigners, the migrants I'm talking about today. So here are three broad contexts for music in the process of migrants gaining a voice as members of a society in which they're racially distinct. I see those contexts for the music making of some newcomer migrant groups here in Japan, even if not yet here in Kawagoe, as documented by colleagues in our 3-year group project. I also see them in the case of Japanese as a small migrant minority in my country, as it was 80 to 100 years ago. So that's what my recent research has been about. These contexts. The first is making music among and for themselves as a fundamental means of affirming, consolidating community and the well-being of individuals. The second and third, which I grouped together here, both involve making music in circumstances that enable non-minority members to hear and watch. And that results in intercultural experience that may lead to a desire for knowledge about and more interaction with the minority people. I group them together here as two contexts, really at either end or along a continuum, according to the extent to which performance is directed outward toward non-migrant group members. Now, outwardly directed performance can involve the sharing and exchange of music with non-minority members, or overtly presentational displays of musical skill directed at members of the dominant host society. And those skills can be in the migrants' own traditions, their own music, if you like, or in styles of music and dance esteemed by the host society. And I want to emphasize the second and third contexts because examples of those are pertinent to the unsilencing of the now almost forgotten minority, Japanese minority in pre-war Australia. So here are some moments from the lives of Japanese and people deemed to be Japanese in disparate parts of Australia in the mid-1930s. The three images show people who can represent the principal groups of Japanese at that time, starting in the center, there, in the center. Young indentured pearl shell divers. There are several Japanese pearl shell divers with their workmates of several ethnicities on a pearling boat, a lugger as they're called, somewhere in the Torres Strait up near New Guinea, near Thursday Island. Over here, some prominent individuals in the onshore support community for the pearl shell labourers, specifically this man and their spouses. The men came to Australia before 1901, so they were able to start families, and here are some of their children. And over here, a powerful business figure, Mr. Sono Kinichi, from the Sydney business world. He was the head from the mid-1930s of Kanematsu Shoten's Sydney office. He's there with singing on a ferry with mixed reception, I think, but with employees and business and associates. Now, these photos include both people born in Australia, these children, and indeed their mother. So the children were already sansei at the time, people born in Australia and people who made their lives and their entire careers there from their teens. And there are also, in the case of the indentured workers and even the businessman, these are people who lived for most or all of the 1930s in Australia before being interned as enemy aliens at the end of 1941. There were many, many others like them. Here, this splendid young 18-year-old was 98 when I met him down in near Kobe a few years ago. And in his room at the old people's home, he had a huge map of the Torres Strait. That's New Guinea up there. This is Australia down here. The very existence of such people in Australia before the war is still unknown to most Australians. Of course, wonderful work has been done by these scholars, and I'm very largely reliant upon it, including most recently the development of a Nikkei Australia project under the leadership of Mayu Kanamori, who may even be out there. At any rate, this is changing the degree of knowledge, both in academia and gradually elsewhere. But on the whole, Australians, even today, assumed that Japanese were not allowed to reside in the Anglo-Celtic dominated society of those early decades of the White Australia policy, formerly known as this Act. This was a policy that not only disallowed immigration by quote-unquote Asians for 6 decades, but also disallowed naturalisation by those already residing in Australia. A handful of Japanese had naturalised to become British subjects before 1901, but all others of the, and these are the numbers we're talking about, of the 2,000 to 4,000 in disparate groups across the country, all others had to justify their presence in Australia when renewing their documentation. There were 2 large groupings of the pre-war Japanese, and that bifurcation is geographic. In the north, this is really the north and the northwest, but I'm going to call it the north, and down here in Sydney. So geographic and demographic division. Demographically, it was mostly people of rural and rather poor, modest background who went to work in the north. Down in Sydney, it was people of urban middle-class origins who joined the trading firms. The great majority were in the north, and they were young males who intended to return to Japan after a stay of a few years, earning as much money as possible. But many of them stayed for much longer, even for decades. And those young men resided in towns, primarily Thursday Island, Broome and Darwin, but also elsewhere. These were towns that were then far more ethnically diverse sites than any of the country's cities. Most were indentured labourers. That's Thursday Island, TI, then with lots of pearling luggers, and now with none. So most were indentured labourers, at first actually on Queensland's sugarcane plantations, but then in the pearl shell industry, based at Thursday Island and Broome over in the west. Others ran businesses that supported the pearling workers, as we saw in one of those earlier photos. And these young men dominated the labour force, and for much of the 1890s, through the peak days of the pearl shell industry in the 1910s, the Japanese made up large portions of the populations of towns in the region. Because the industry found that Europeans, whites, could not do this work well, it was entirely reliant on labour of Asian origin, in particular the Japanese who were in high demand as divers. And that was the most important and relatively well paid of the marine tasks. For that reason, indentured pearling workers were exempt from the infamous dictation test when entering the country, and they were also able to renew their periods of employment multiple times. So today they might be called sojourner labourers, or to use a wonderful oxymoron, temporary migrants. Importantly, very importantly, the exemption did not allow them to bring spouses. The small numbers of Japanese females in the pearling town communities were almost all women who had come either before 1901 or the children of such women, or sex workers, karayuki-san, Japanese prostitutes who had been smuggled into Australia, mostly via Singapore. When the Japanese consul requested in 1908 that workers be allowed to bring spouses, the then, well, in effect, the foreign minister of the day replied that as any children born from such unions in Australia would be British subjects, such exclusion was necessary for our very existence. I've italicized the our there. So this is a very different situation to that of the Japanese diasporas in North America and Brazil, and far smaller numbers involved, proportionate to the population of Australia. The Japanese communities in the north were in towns characterised by diverse and largely segregated populations. However, there was a remarkable degree of crossing of racial boundaries in leisure activities. For sports in particular, there are many surviving images of this, and these are some of my favourites. The wonderful Japanese rowing race, on Thursday Island, and again on TI, the Japanese Sports Carnival, signposted in English, so anyone can come and enjoy the spectacle. And another kind of spectacle over in Broome, there were frequently sumo and kendo tournaments. In this case, a sumo match with an audience of all sorts of people from the town of Broome. You can see these kids, and particularly this fellow is a dyed-in-the-wool Aussie boy, probably with one of his father or his uncle or someone, pearlers in their distinctive pearling whites, but also some crew who were probably from Indonesia or Timor or thereabouts, enjoying the opening spectacle, which was 1.5-year-old Joe Murakami displaying his technique. All right, moving to the other group of people who were largely exempt from the White Australia policy, the students, tourists and merchants. Most of that last group were the trading firm managers and their staff in the Sydney business world. According to Pam Oliver's pioneering work, by the 1920s, Sydney was home to more than 40 Japanese firms, and individuals of senior status in the firms were allowed to bring their spouses and start families. Others married there in Sydney, and often to Anglo-Australians. Here's a splendid image of the nuptials of Elizabeth Girard and Hirokichi Nakamura in 1917. Nakamura was the owner of a small trading firm in Sydney at that time. And then by 1940, as Pam Oliver tells us, an army map of Japanese living in Sydney shows the distribution of 319 Japanese families. I think that meant households rather than families, but 60 of them lived in Mossman. And here's a beautiful image of one of the most illustrious families, that of Sam Hirodo, as he called himself, standing above dreamlike Mossman Bay. And it's still a dreamlike place, I can assure you. Many people in, actually there's a few more images. So there's a rich visual record of that shared world of social life and leisure from the 1900s through 1930s. That, of course, was the first one of the first three images I showed you, the only one of music making with Sono Kinichi singing on a ferry. Okay, so many people in Sydney business circles, I'll leave that there, had frequent and diverse forms of contact with those Japanese, both on and off the job. And their children attended the same public and private schools, many of which were in fact church schools. In Pam Oliver's words, some accepted this process of assimilation as positive evidence of Japanese becoming Australian and welcomed them as citizens. Now, turning back to music, what examples can we find? There's a fair amount of documentation of music making in the first of the three contexts I outlined, that is communal and individual performances solely within the Japanese migrant communities. I have some images which might be useful in discussion, but I'm going to concentrate on the other two contexts as they're more relevant for my theme, involving experiences of music and dance that were available across ethnic and racial bounds. And they continued right up until just before the two countries were at war. The earliest of the examples for this second context is from 1895, the earliest that I could find. And this was a theatrical and dance event staged in Broome upon the outcome of the First Sino-Japanese War. Before I look at what the journalist said, I want to come down here and say that this earliest example shows us that women made important contributions to these performances. As the marine workers were not permitted to bring their spouses, as we heard, inevitably brothels in the pearling towns did a thriving trade. And not only in the pearling towns, there were some in inland mining towns at the edge of the deserts too. Several sources claim that Karayuki-san were the dancers at this large celebratory event in Broome in 1895, as well as some important subsequent events. So one of the local journalists noted that there'd been 6 weeks of assiduous rehearsals and that there was every prospect of 2 very pleasant evenings being spent by the coloured and white population. it was only a prospect because after the first dance, someone knocked over a kerosene lamp and burnt the whole thing down. It was a disaster and a tragedy. However, 10 years later, at the outcome of the Nichiro Senso, the war with Russia, the Japanese community erected a similarly splendid stage, semi-outdoor, clad in Australia's finest corrugated iron with some beer bottles on the ground. They probably have kerosene in them. And there were some excerpts from kabuki performed on this stage with 2, perhaps even 3 shamisen players right there. Another kind of celebratory performance, but this time one which could also be, no, I'm sorry, I'm still in the second context. So another kind of sort of performance in this second context, or if you like, that end of the continuum, were celebratory performances for the Taisho and Showa imperial enthronements. And we have a splendid set of photos from 1915, the Taisho enthronement celebrations, again in Broome, where young girls and young adolescents of the Japanese community in Broome presented Nihonbuyo in this case, and some folk dance, which is not the title of which is not noted on the back of the photo. I'm going to skip to the next slide and then come back to this. These were, of course, taken by Murakami Yasukichi, who was running a photography business in Broome, and in fact was the father of Joe Murakami, whom I referred to. Okay, there was no documentation in the paper that I could find for the 1915 celebrations, but in 1928, for the Showa enthronement, the largest paper in that part of the country had this to say, that there was a gorgeous lantern procession in which 400 Japanese, around 400, participated in beautiful costuming, parading around the town. Among other things, they chanted religious songs. And this was watched by hundreds of Europeans, as well as people of various ethnicities from the Pearling Fleet. And then it goes on to praise the kimonos, but the whole effect of the Japanese posture dancing, the odori, correctly romanized, remarkably enough, as the principal attraction in an entertainment which is never seen elsewhere in Australia, a Japanese variety play. So that was clearly an enge kai with various kinds of entertainment, and it was appreciated for 2 nights, highly appreciated for 2 nights running, probably dancing of that sort. But most important, I think, for this context, because of its regularity, was the bon odori. Regularity in the sense that every August there were, well, not only bon odori, but various kinds of obon festivities in the town of Broome, and they became an annual spectacle and an outing for most of the people of the town, which was a population of about 3,000 or 4,000 at that time. And this included the indigenous Australian Aboriginal, or some of the Aboriginal members of the Broome population. That's the only image we have of bon odori in pre-war Australia, as far as I know, August 1933. There's no account of that, but 2 years later, a doctor stationed in Broome, Dr. Alan Vickers, took his family and his friends down to see the Japanese dancers on the square in front of the club. And they were very impressed by the costuming and the entire setup, and noted that the accompaniment was a big drum and a chorus. Okay, to move to, let me say, I was hoping to hear about bon odori in pre-war Sydney. And I spoke to the only person now alive who was old enough to remember. This is Messe Shizue-san. She appeared in one of those earlier photos. She was the daughter of Sam Hirodo. And she said, no, there was no such thing. And indeed, there were no public communal events in which what we'd now call traditional Japanese music and dance were performed down in Sydney. I'll come back to that later on. So the third context, the sharing and display of musical skills and resources. Japanese sometimes engaged in sharing music with the people they worked with daily, especially with indigenous Torres Strait Islanders, among who were crew members on the pearling luggers from a certain period on. Oral historical work done in the 70s and 80s by both Japanese and Australian researchers yielded ample evidence for song exchange between Japanese and Islander crews. You can see from reading some of these quotes. According to a very important source, a Japanese a pearl diver's diary, which we can call the Takimoto Diary, Takimoto Nikki, and some further oral historical work done in the 90s, including that by Konishi and Hayward. According to these sources, Islander groups who were presumably the home communities of indigenous crew members also hosted Japanese crewmen when boats were at anchor, included them as audience for celebratory events, and sometimes taught them dances and parts of associated songs. And it seems some Japanese may have reciprocated. So those occasions were for sharing music were recalled in very positive tones, as you can see down here, by both Japanese and Islander interviewees. Japanese also used music as displays of sophistication and accomplishment directed to the broader communities and social circles they lived amongst in two quite distinct ways. And here the geographic and demographic bifurcation is again significant. In the north, elaborate Japanese music theatre and dance presentations on public occasions that included key celebrations of British imperial polity. So they were the Japanese community's contributions to those celebratory occasions. In other words, music was used to demonstrate the Japanese migrants' acknowledgement of the basic terms for Australia's existence as a self-governing British colony, as it was up until 1931. There are several examples of this kind of performance. Just one here. In 1902, for the scheduled coronation of Edward VII, some people on Thursday Island wrote and mounted what was billed as a grand Japanese opera. A reviewer for the Torres Strait Pilot, noted the very high level of artistry that was involved and felt that on the whole performance in every detail was illustrative, it must have been, illustrative of the finer and higher side of Japanese life. There were several other such display performances documented in the regional press of the North. But down in Sydney, such conspicuously Japanese or Oriental, they would have been called, performances were confined to brief demonstrations given at the consul's residence by visitors from Japan, or by crew members of visiting naval ships. Among the resident Japanese, as we heard, even Bon-Odori did not take place. According to both the documentary record and oral accounts then, the music performed or shared in contact settings and on public occasions in Sydney almost never included identifiably Japanese genres. It was almost exclusively Western, yogaku. And dancing figures prominently in all of that. It seems that there were Japanese couples, corporate couples, who could dance at charity events such as this one in September 1930. This was the first of a series that took place during the 1930s when visiting Japanese freighters, large ships such as the Kitano Maru, were lent for dancers to raise funds, in this case for the District Nursing Association. So the dance music was relayed by loudspeakers to every part of the top deck, which was decked out, decorated with in various ways. And the consul was there, and various prominent Japanese residents arranged parties. Here they are. Reading between the lines, I think we can assume that some of these prominent residents came with their spouses and were able to participate in the dancing. And then there's, after that, talks about the gorgeous frocks, but we won't go into that. Turning to the younger single employees of the Japanese firms, some of them went to learn dancing as a social grace and to meet potential partners. Again, to quote Pam Oliver, Japanese also frequented ballroom dancing classes in the city where Australian girls attended in groups, and some of those meetings led to marriage. Now, the final example for Sydney is the fascinating Sono Yasu-san, or Nagami Yasu-san, as she was when she was a young socialite and a kabuki fan in Osaka, before she married Sono Kinichi, the man we saw singing on the ferry, and moved to Australia. She was the daughter of a bank manager in Osaka. They also had a house, a besso country house in Ashia, and she was given opportunities to seriously study oil painting, piano, and classical singing. And her teachers included some of the best in the Kansai at the time, including a white Russian refugee, in effect, in Kobe. Her son, whose name is written with a very interesting set of characters we might discuss later, wrote about the piano, the Australian piano that they bought for the home in Sydney and then brought back to Japan. You can now see it on display in a university near Osaka. Among other things, he wrote that his mother, at parties at our house and at the residence of the Japanese Consul General, my mother would often accompany herself on piano while singing Australian, English, Japanese, and other art songs, kakyoku. So, some summary comments on the examples that I've shown. In the northern communities, most music making, at least as documented in the written oral, historical, and visual record, was identifiably Japanese. Why? One answer is the rural origins and only primary level education of most of the marine workers. They'd not had nearly as much exposure to Western music, to yogaku, as urban Japanese of the 1890s through 1910s. After that, once you get in the 1920s and the music industry develops in Japan and people have more access to chikuonki, wind-up players and so on, it changes. But certainly up to around 1920, that was the case. Another reason, however, is, as I said, the small port towns of the north were the most ethnically diverse in Australia. And while a strict racial hierarchy operated within the daily business of the pearling luggers, in leisure time, there was a willingness to enjoy what some of the groups of foreign labourers presented, acknowledging sophistication and refinement in the case of the Japanese performances. So in the north, there was never any question of the Japanese assimilating. The lines between them and the whites were clearly drawn in so many ways, including in music. But down in Sydney, no such conspicuously ethnic music was presented in public. And that strategic avoidance probably contributed to what was an apparently successful effort by the resident Japanese to minimise their otherness. In other words, to accord with the middle-class lifestyles and perceived values of their hosts, to assimilate up to a point. What urban business people, including the wives of senior managers, chose to display to white Australia was evidence of their cosmopolitanism in the form of interest and proficiency in Euro-American music styles. Accomplishment in those styles, the music most valued by the host society, was important as an expression of willingness to connect through shared affective experience. The young men from remote regions of Japan who went to even more remote parts of Australia from the 1880s on went for the money. Of course they did. The trading firm reps who went to Sydney went for the same reasons, but probably also with a patriotic desire to contribute to the grand enterprise of expanding Japanese commerce and geopolitical influence. Yet many of them, in effect, settled in Australia, forming not only businesses, but also friendships, marriages, and in some cases, even families. They were subject to many forms of discrimination, formal and informal, but they made gestures to build trust and amicability with both white and indigenous Australians. In the latter case, they were co-workers and sometimes hosts to the Japanese in the north. Those gestures often involved sports, but not infrequently music and dance, and surviving responses to those shared moments of leisure suggest that they significantly contributed to improving the quality of racial relations. So in view of all that, down here really, in view of all that, I would argue that for many of the pre-war Japanese, the circumstances and the length of their presence in Australia and the nature of their on-the-ground relations and efforts, including musical efforts to build bridges with surrounding communities in daily life gave them a hard-earned claim to membership of the nation. Now, in another context, I would finish there, but I want to bookend the talk by turning back, excuse me, to newcomer migrants in 21st century Japan, where circumstances are utterly different, of course. One of the most important differences is the current rhetoric of multicultural coexistence on the part of the host society's bureaucracy. That's something that was literally unthinkable in the pre-war era. There was hardly even any language for describing racial equality and tolerance then. Arguably, however, these three things, the following three things, are similar to what Japanese faced in old Australia. Firstly, default monocultural assumptions and practices throughout most of the host society. Secondly, official denial of immigration or migrant status. Thirdly, pervasive and persistent anxiety about the entry of large numbers of foreigners as a threat to the integrity of race, culture, and a way of life. Now, in the face of those characteristics of 21st century Japan as a host society, moreover, the same three broad contexts for minority music making are certainly identifiable. Very briefly, here are some examples for the now very substantial Nepalese community, which is an intergenerational community now. And as I chose this for a number of reasons, one of them is that Dr. Yamanaka will be speaking about this next week, I believe, at the CGS. And in a current publication, she says that with a growing contingent of dependents, the Nepali population is halfway through building a semi-permanent resident community. Right, so in the membership of our group project was Dr. Sawan Joshi, now of Kathmandu, but he was a 20-year resident of Tokyo. And he did wonderful field work over the 3 years of the project. Here's just a snippet of one of the videos that he produced at an event mounted by, interestingly enough, the Nepal Tamang Artist Association of Japan. The Tamang are one of the many ethnic groups of the Nepalese. This is their new year. I don't know how to pronounce this, Sonam Losha or something, held around the 21st of January. And the reason I've chosen this is there's not a single Japanese letter on the publicity. So this is directed to other Tamang and to other Nepalese. And in the several hours long musical event that someone documented, he said he couldn't recognize any Japanese, ethnic Japanese in the room. That's to quote him. Sorry, it's not starting. Here it goes. Just a brief musical example. So the point there is that, I think I can see someone who might be Japanese, but it would be only that one person if indeed she was Japanese. So this is entirely internally directed musicking within the Tamang and more broadly the Nepalese community. Another kind of festival of various of the Nepalese ethnic groups is Tej. And this is still often, sorry, I have to do this. Yes, this is still often an entirely closed affair. In fact, right here in Kawagoe, I was lucky enough to see a poster, not like this, because this has some Japanese on it, but I saw a poster which had only English, in fact, on it, and was able to go and buy dinner at an Indo-Nepali restaurant and heard the Tej festivities going on upstairs, and was even granted a minute with the door open, where I saw, I could step through that door out of Japan into an entirely Nepalese environment. That was Tej in Kawagoe, and in most places it seems to be an internal event. However, this poster includes some Japanese, and also it was a larger scale Tej held at Shiba Park near the Tokyo Tower. So, if you like, making it available to Japanese to come and watch. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum is the entirely outward directed Nepal Festival, here with a publicity poster almost all in Japanese, and the involvement of the Nepalese Tourism Board and other powerful organizations, exhorting the Japanese, as you could in the pre-COVID era, to come and enjoy all these sorts of things in Nepal. Okay, I'm going to have to finish, so let me just move to my conclusion slide. As various scholars have observed, the first immigration era since the end of the Japanese Empire has begun. And with the ever-increasing presence of migrant minorities comes a slew of questions about rights and claims to membership in the nation for people who are not ethnic Japanese. Tabunka Kyosei, multicultural existence cannot be a temporary or optional disposition to simply help the majority through periods of stressful contact with outsiders. Once people settle here and establish intergenerational continuity, as is already the case for various minorities, including the Nepalis, as Yamanaka sensei has told us, once that happens, then the rhetoric of multicultural coexistence must acquire depth through pragmatic actualization, so that the concerns and opinions of newcomer migrants can gain greater representation in civic life. The case of the small Japanese minority in old Australia suggests that even under a regime of acutely racialized thought and excessive constraints imposed by a dominant ethnic group, minority groups can have agency in sharing and presenting music at times and in places that allow for a degree of intercultural experience that enhances curiosity, knowledge, and willingness to listen with respect. Put another way, even people who are systematically shut out of imaginings about membership of a nation, Japanese workers in pre-war Australia and foreign residents in Japan today who are not acknowledged as migrants, even such people can engage in activities on the ground that help make them audible in public discourse. And I'm looking forward to hearing both the music and the views and opinions of the newcomers right here in Kawagoe. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor De Ferranti. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Keiko Yamanaka to give comments on the presentation. Keiko-san, please.
May I ask for closing?
Thank you. Yes, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. All right, so share screen. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Hugh, for sharing your very interesting, painstaking research about very unknown topic that is about musicking of the Japanese communities in the pre-war period in Australia. So I have come up with three major themes to share with the audience as the contribution of your work to international migration studies. I am very novice to this area about the music in the minority communities. So comment tended to be very general, but yet I really emphasize that your research is very eye-opening, and we are aware that there were diverse communities of sojourning divers in the pearl shelling industries in the north of Australia before the World War II, and yet we do not know much about their community lives or family lives, which was prohibited primarily, and not to mention their musicking. So your work is unearthing all these interesting topics and hidden themes of this community. So very, very important. Thank you. So I learned from your research that there is much to discuss ethnic minorities' cultural politics toward recognition and inclusion despite the rigid racial hierarchy. The presentation also shows the importance of music, dance, and sports in migrant communities, not only for obvious cultural reasons for migrants themselves, but also for appreciation of different arts and performances shared with the dominant race, as well as many other ethnic minorities, despite the Australia's exclusionary regime during the period. So let me start with the division by class and region. Within the tiny Japanese immigrant population in the pre-war Australia, there were divisions along class, region of residence, and to the lesser degree by gender. The class lines in performing arts and goals of political inclusion show varying interests and forms of musicking. For the upper class businessmen and their families in big cities, music meant primarily classic Western music and instruments, and the goals were to keep their status as highly sophisticated, modern, and therefore assimilable Japanese into Anglo-Australian societies. The upper class elite Japanese people went on to great lengths in their efforts to convince the host society that they were not racial others. But in their private lives, they celebrated the New Year, for example, with traditional music and instruments such as shakuhachi and koto, as well as popular instrument, mandarin and harmonica. And also, important point is that since they are able to bring their families, the photos of the wives and the young children attest that they played an important role in the community's cultural activities and politics within the host society. In contrast, by law, working class men were prohibited from bringing their families, and thus many were unaccompanied or unmarried. Therefore, for divers and others in the marine industry and laborers in the plantation agriculture in the remote regions, music, dance, and sports must have been a very important form of leisure and entertainment. I understand that they enjoyed all sorts of traditional Japanese music, dance, and sports among themselves, but at the same time, important point that author's presentation made is that they shared the music, dance, sports with the work colleagues who often worked in the same industry and boat. All sorts of traditional music with the not only colleagues, but also neighbors who were also oppressed minorities. So there is a multiculturalism and a shared among themselves through music. And their performance was also occasionally shared with Anglo-Australian in towns. I also learned that the music among working class men in the remote area also included Western music as they learned it in the Japanese school curriculum in the later years. Another important point that Hugh made was very interesting to me. That is, there were a small number of Colloquium migrant women working in the sex industry who arrived even before the turn of the century, and there's a small presence of them as this bachelor community, so-called, needed. And they were also part of the Japanese diaspora. They must have also engaged in all kinds of music among themselves and also with clients and host society. So this is an important question to ask how gender made a difference or unique point in terms of musicking among this diasporic community. But when it came to big national events, such as military victories and imperial enthronements, the Japanese diaspora community came together, and including the Bon dance, seasonal important celebration for Japanese people. So they come up with all kinds of elaborate preparation for performances of traditional music, dance, and theater. This such performances clearly and successfully attracted attention of the Australian host society. That so to some degree it contributed to the recognition of different cultures. And we also see there in the celebration of events, such events, the national pride of Japanese people in the diaspora away from home. Third point that I want to make, which I really appreciate that Hugh connected this contemporary immigration landscape in Japan. This is what I do in my research, primarily through Nepalese communities. And that author draws a parallel with the silenced strangers in contemporary Japan, where ethnic diversity has significantly increased, yet public recognition for the presence is limited. Therefore, there are enclaves of music and dances around throughout the Japanese cities and the towns. And then political leaders ignore such reality in policy making, as Hugh pointed out. And in the pre-war white Australia, Japanese music was hardly audible because they were spotted in, sporadically located in the remote areas, and there were big cities or among small population of Japanese people living in there. But in contemporary Japan today, if Japanese people turn their ears to something inaudible yet, they will hear singing voices and dancing figures of the strangers, such as Nepalese, Vietnamese, Myanmar people in every corner of Japanese cities and towns. So the big message of this old diasporas of Japanese during the pre-war racial exclusion period in Australia tells us that we have to listen to the music of the strangers inaudible, but turn it to the audible and just watch them to perform. You will see these people are not somebody unknown, yet they are your friends, neighbors who live in the same neighborhood, and colleagues who probably work in the convenience stores and the factories who have arrived to Japan from all over the world. So there are lots of interesting comparisons historically as well as contemporarily in international migration with this very fine studies by Professor Hugh de Ferranti. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugh and Keiko-san. We are actually running out of time, but we can take a couple of questions quickly.
Yes, it's my fault. Sorry, I spoke for a little bit too long. I think.
It's great that we are actually having really good discussion, and I think Keiko-san's comments were also quite informative and thought-provoking. So our first question is from Iman Wang. Could you say a bit more about Japanese residents, musical and other forms of interactions with other minorities, such as Chinese in Australia, especially in relation to the two Sino-Japanese wars?
Thank you for that question. Of course, the Chinese diaspora in Australia is very large. Apparently, close to 5% of Australians claim Chinese descent today. That's a figure I read the other day. And it goes back to the mid-19th century. And in fact, there is some important research on the history of Chinese music making since that time. There were many kinds of interactions between the small Japanese community and the larger Chinese community, including, well, if we restrict the discussion to the settings that I have looked at in those small towns of the north, there were, of course, Chinese there, but they weren't involved in the pearling industry itself, in pearl shelling. They were running all other kinds of businesses in Broome and Thursday Island and so on. So the interactions were not in the context of daily work relations, but they were certainly in the context of daily life. And indeed, there are some important marriages between Japanese and Chinese. Marriage, interestingly enough, was not prohibited under the White Australia policy. A Japanese could marry an Australian. And of course, we're talking about Chinese who were born in Australia and were before 1901 and were British subjects. So, in fact, one of the slides I showed you of the girls dancing at the 1915 Taisho enthronement celebrations, several of those girls were from the Chai family, very illustrious family in Broome even today. So their mother was Japanese and their father was Chinese. As for musical interactions, I don't know of any. The gekkin, which is a Chinese instrument of Min Shingaku, so Ming and Qin dynasty music, was very popular in Japan at the time, and I do know there were gekkin being played in Australia at the time. In fact, the lead slide and the one that was on the CJS's publicity site shows a mixed group of Japanese and white Australians, some of whom are playing gekkin. But that's just a Chinese instrument that was popular in Japan. In relation to the two Sino-Japanese wars, I wish I knew about that. Thank you for a stimulating question. I'm going to look into it further. Of course, one imagines that Chinese residents of Broome and TI and so on were not keen to come and be among the coloured and white population, as it was called in that newspaper article from the time. Probably not keen to come and be in the coloured and white mixed audience for the celebrations of the Japanese victory. But thank you again for a great question.
Okay, the second question is from Valerie Sampson, and her question is: were announcements of musical events in smaller communities more likely to reach the dominant culture than in larger cities? Were intentions different dependent on the size of the communities?
In short, yes. I think they had to be different depending on the size of the communities. We're talking about very small towns, or they're still quite small towns up in the north, but at the time, probably between 2,000 and 4,000 people. So most people could recognize other people in those communities. There was, as I said, in certain contexts, particularly leisure time, a lot of interaction between the ethnicities which otherwise lived apart in what was called Japtown or Yokohama on Thursday Island and so on. So in such a small place, of course, the musical events were, let's face it, there wasn't a lot to do in leisure time. So a spectacular music drama of some sort mounted on a beautiful stage would attract most of the people in the town. As for, well, down in Sydney, where we're dealing with the largest city in the country, much smaller than it is today, but I think it rather than the size of the communities involved, it was more to do with the social stratification, so that the intention of musical interaction was, as I think I said, to display musical skills that were appropriate to people, well, cosmopolitans of upper middle class or even elite of the time. I know there's more to say in response to that, but I'm just aware there are a few more questions.
Yes, well, we keep receiving questions. Maybe we can quickly answer to a couple more questions. This is from Carl Neuenfeld. Where did Japanese instruments brought into Australia come from?
Hello, Carl. Thank you for a question. A very good question, as ever. Well, funnily enough, from Japan, but probably via places where there were large Japanese communities, Singapore, via Palau, I think, maybe Saipan, Davao in the southern Philippines. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to look into it.
Okay, next question is from Mariko Ano. And I'm curious to know more about the kabuki performance in 1905. Would you be able to talk about who these performers were or where they learned the art from?
Yes, thank you, Mariko. Very difficult question, which I can't really answer. They may have been, some of them may have been visitors. I've heard about, but unfortunately not had a chance to go and look at the shipping records to see what musicians, performers potentially were on the ships that visited Broome from that time on. That's one of the tasks I should address in this ongoing research. And of course, this question is also relevant for the girls and young adolescents who were dancing at the enthronement celebrations. Who taught them the Nihon Buyo? The Nihon Buyo specifically, because that girl was, the name of that dance was written by the photographer on the back. She was in what seems to be the right costuming and was posing with some skill. So that's another question I'd love to have an answer for. Thank you.
Okay, last question from Patricia Yarrow. By colored is the reference to Japanese. Were Japanese lumped into the indigenous aboriginals under the cover of colored?
Oh, no. Well, of course, the word colored referred to anyone who wasn't white, but the distinctions were many and quite fine. There was a hierarchy in operating in the pearling towns, quite a complex hierarchy. which I didn't have time to talk about. But the Japanese were generally, and sometimes the Chinese too, depending on context, were at the top of it. And then going, unfortunately, right down at the bottom were the Australian indigenous Aboriginals, with the Torres Strait Islanders usually a step up from them. But in that article, the newspaper report, I think it was about the 1895 event, it said the coloured and white population. One would assume that was a celebration of the outcome of the First Sino-Japanese War, so probably most of the quote-unquote coloured people in the audience were Japanese people, pearlers, indentured pearlers, but probably also some of the other people that they worked with, people from Timor, Indonesia, and so on. Thanks for that question too.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor De Ferranti. This was a wonderful opportunity to learn about your work and also to co-host an event with TITEC. Thank you.
Well, if I can just say what a delight it has been to be back, not in Berkeley, but back at Berkeley, or presenting for Berkeley, but also for Tokyo Tech, and from Kawagoe, and about the Japanese in Australia. So this closes a lot of circles over a long time. And I thank everyone who's put so much effort into making this event possible, both right there in the CJS and at Tokyo Tech too. And thank you again, Bonnie and Keiko. It's been great to do this together.
Thank you. So
thank you, everyone.
We close our next event, the CJS next event will be held on September 16th, 5 to 5:30 p.m. And that will be given by Dr. Keiko Yamanaka. The title is Nepali Migration to Japan and Korea, Converging Ends, Diverging Path, and Contrasting Effects. And I hope to see many of you again. Take care and thank you.